I want to persuade viewers who are naturalists or garden lovers why you should write a diary, or I prefer to call it a journal because I don't write every day. Since we've had social media, we're not writing diaries, but the history of diary writing goes back centuries, at least as far as the Romans. Naturalists have often written diaries about their observations. The Reverend Gilbert White of Selborne in Hampshire wrote in the 18th century about things that were happening in his parish, the birds and the plants and the seasons and so on. In the next century, Henry David Thoreau wrote about Walden Pond. And that, of course, also appeared as a book later. And then John Muir wrote later in the 19th century about his first summer in the Sierra. Even my grandmother, an ordinary English woman, wrote in a diary every day, not so much about nature, but about society. And it would have been wonderful to have that diary today. It has been lost because it would have told the story of how British society evolved from the Victorian era through much of the 20th century. But for naturalists and for gardeners, there are wonderful things to record that are really useful and interesting later on, like the success of various seeds, when to plant, when to harvest, how good the harvest was. Was it better in a hot summer or a wet summer? How insect pests and fungal pests vary from year to year. The growth of trees, how the landscape changes, and so many more things. I've been writing a diary for more than 50 years. And looking back at some of those recordings, it gives me great pleasure. And also, in the garden, it helps to shape the plan for the future season, to see what was successful the year before, or even 20 years before. One of my first entries was as a very young teenager, living in the countryside just outside London. I was a keen naturalist already, and watching badgers after nightfall. So here's an entry. It was actually on Christmas Day, 1963, and I recorded the weather. It was wet, and the moon was shining later. There was a westerly wind. I didn't have a companion that night as I went into the wood. And I wrote, as I was going for a walk on Christmas evening, I decided to have a look at the badger's set. That's the badger's home underground. I arrived there at 6:20 p.m. I waited under the oak tree for 20 minutes before I decided to make my way home slowly. I heard a badger making strange noises down at one end of the set. I think it was dragging bedding into its underground home. I went very slowly down the edge of the field, but did not go far before I heard an animal in the bracken. It came out on the path 20 yards in front of me. It then bolted back the same way it had come. I then saw Popeye by a set. Popeye was a code name for a very rare white badger that we were watching. He sat at the scent entrance and scratched at the ground before disappearing down a hole. More recently, I've been writing about my Virginia garden, and as you can see in this journal, there's quite a lot of entries for the last 5 years, but they go back 15. On April the 6th, 2019, I wrote, "There have been huge temperature swings here. Today, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Yesterday, 74 degrees. Tomorrow, 50 degrees perhaps, and down to the mid-30s at night with sleet or snow possible. I worked for 8 hours in the garden yesterday. Only 60 degrees, but I got a little bit burnt. Another yard of mushroom compost was delivered for the raised beds and the turning circle. I've planted lots of seeds in the ground, or trays in the greenhouse, but they're growing very slowly. The white daffodils are still in bloom, and some cherry blossom is out. The maple trees are turning red. I mowed the lawn for the first time. The mock orange are in flower already. I found a full bluebird nest in our box in the back garden, and there are bluebirds visiting the second box in our neighbour's yard. There are more birds today at the feeder: bluebirds, jays, red-winged blackbirds, chickadees, tufted tits, chipping sparrows, white-throated sparrows, yellow-rumped warblers. Last week I had a hermit thrush before it heads off for the mountains. Maybe there will be a crow's nest this year, and if so, the family may keep the hawks away that keep preying on our small birds. These records mean nothing to you, but they mean something to me, and they give me pleasure, and they're useful. You don't have to be a writer. You don't have to enter books into a nicely bound book, although I prefer this to electronic media as it's more likely to be lasting. But I do urge you to think about setting aside a few minutes just to record your observations. It could be just over a cup of coffee. Just a few words jotted down may be enjoyed later on. And you won't regret it when you find that old journal on the shelf. I wish we still had my grandmother's diary.